With the release of the Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, fans new and old are being reintroduced to one of gaming's zombie darlings. So we here at the Leaderboard decided to take some time and get reacquainted with the world and story of Dead Rising. With each of the games taking place years apart from each other and the story being spread across different mediums, we wanted to make things easier for everyone. So today, we brought you the Simplified Dead Rising Timeline. Now before we begin, we call this the Simplified Timeline because we're going to tell a pretty easy to follow sequence of events. There are comics, films, DLC, so on and so forth that may make the story way more complex than it is. So we're going to boil it down to the essentials and not spend too much time on ancillary content. Get it? Got it? Nice. Now, our story begins in the 1990s in Santa Cabeza. In the heart of Central America is a small, quiet town called Santa Cabeza, which becomes the home of a US government research facility. The facility houses a team of scientists led by Dr. Russell Barnaby, working towards their goal of doubling the livestock population by enhancing the growth of local cattle. Their research accelerates when they stumble upon an undiscovered insect species near the Pachacamac River. The species, later named Ampulex compressa giganteus, is no ordinary insect. The scientists discover that the queen insects have the ability to attach to hosts, consume their brain tissue, and reanimate their corpses into mindless zombies. In their larval stage, the queens produce a unique chemical that drives infected hosts into a state of unsatiable hunger, compelling them to eat anything, even substances they don't normally consume. This feeding frenzy provides the nutrients necessary for the queen's growth. Ecstatic about these findings, the researchers plan to harness this chemical to increase cattle appetites, aiming to produce fatter livestock for American markets. This plan spirals out of control when several queens escape the lab and begin infecting the residents of Santa Cabeza, transforming the town into ground zero for a devastating zombie outbreak. As the infection spreads, word reaches the US government. The decision is made to send in military special forces led by Brock Mason to contain the outbreak at all costs. And by all costs, this means eradicating the town completely. Santa Cabeza and its inhabitants are erased from existence. Dr. Barnaby and his team are extracted safely, and to cover up the truth, Barnaby shifts blame onto the residents of Santa Cabeza, claiming the town was a terrorist stronghold where a zombie drug was being developed. Unbeknownst to Dr. Barnaby and the others responsible for the events in Santa Cabeza, two survivors remain, Carlito Keys and his younger sister Isabella. They know exactly what happened, and they are not about to let the truth stay buried. September 19th through 22nd, 2006, the Willamette Incident, Dead Rising. Sometime in 2006, photojournalist Frank West receives intel about an incident in the town of Willamette, Colorado, and decides he wants the scoop. What the government calls a riot is, in reality, a zombie outbreak that overruns the town of Willamette, home to a population of 53,594 individuals. On September 19th, with the help of helicopter pilot Ed DeLuca, Frank asks to be dropped off on the rooftop of Willamette Parkview Mall. Inside the mall, a small group of survivors barricade themselves for safety, while Carlito Keys sets up a hideout to monitor the events unfolding inside and outside the mall. On the rooftop, Frank encounters Carlito. Not knowing who he is, their conversation is brief before Frank heads inside to the mall's entrance, where survivors fortify barricades against the zombies. While helping gather supplies, Frank notices a suspicious old man, but chaos breaks out as the zombies breach the mall entrance. In the ensuing panic, Frank takes refuge in the mall's security room with the help from DHS agent Brad Garrison. There, Frank meets Otis, the mall's janitor, who assists him in navigating the mall, and Jesse McCarney, Brad's partner, who identifies the suspicious old man as Dr. Russell Barnaby, the lead scientist behind the Santa Cabeza research facility. As Frank investigates, he pieces together the outbreak's origins and teams up with Brad and Jesse, who reveal their connection to Homeland Security. Frank and Brad attempt to locate and protect Barnaby, but they face multiple challenges along the way. Frank discovers a strange wasp that, when killed, causes nearby zombies' heads to explode, offering a clue about the outbreak's nature. Meanwhile, they repeatedly clash with Carlito, who tries to sabotage their efforts. Brad gets injured and needs medicine, forcing Frank to confront Steve, a deranged psychopath controlling the supermarket and holding a woman hostage. After defeating Steve, Frank rescues the woman, who reveals connections to Santa Cabeza. Through his investigations, Frank learns the woman is Isabella Keys, Carlito's sister. She reveals that Carlito is using the mall to spread the zombie parasites across the country by hiding bombs in trucks. Brad and Frank race to disable the bombs, but a shootout with Carlito leaves him fatally wounded. Before dying, Carlito pushes Brad into a horde of zombies. Frank later finds Brad, who, gravely injured and about to turn, asks Frank to end his life and slides his gun over as a final gesture. Frank later encounters Carlito, held captive by Larry, a psychotic butcher. After defeating Larry, Frank retrieves a locket from Carlito which gives Isabella the password to her brother's computer. This allows her to disable the signal jammer blocking communications. Despite their efforts, the US Special Forces arrive to clean up the outbreak, aiming to cover up the incident much like Santa Cabeza. In the chaos, Jessie survives, but since she was bitten earlier by Barnaby, succumbs to zombification from Barnaby's earlier attack and is ultimately lost. Otis manages to steal a military helicopter and evacuate the survivors Frank saved. Meanwhile, Frank waits for DeLuca to retrieve him on the helipad. However, a stowaway zombie attacks DeLuca, causing the helicopter to crash into a nearby clock tower. Frank, overwhelmed and stranded, prepares for the worst and just sits there in the middle of a crowd of zombies. Isabella finds Frank in time to save him, but he collapses from infection. She discovers that Frank carries the wasp parasite, but has an unusual resistance, buying him time before turning. Together, they gather supplies to synthesize a drug that temporarily suppresses the infection. Isabella uncovers a chilling truth from Carlito's computer. Carlito had infected 50 orphans with parasites and spread them across the country. As Frank and Isabella escape the mall, Frank faces Brock Mason, the cleanup commander and leader of the Santa Cabeza operation. After a long and brutal fight, Frank finally overpowers Brock, who falls into a horde of zombies. Frank eventually escapes, and his report exposes the Willamette incident and the events of Santa Cabeza, but the government quickly shifts blame to the Central American drug trade. Willamette is labeled a terrorist attack. Despite the cover-up, Frank and Isabella's efforts ensure the truth eventually reaches the world. Though, there is the problem of Carlito's orphans that remains a lingering threat. 2006 to 2008, the rise of Phenotrans. Following the Willamette incident, the pharmaceutical company Phenotrans is founded and begins manufacturing the anti-zombification drug Zombrex. This new drug, based on research conducted by Isabella Keyes during the Willamette incident, prevents zombification for up to 12 hours. Around this time, Marion Mallon is also announced as the director of Phenotrans. 2008, the Las Vegas incident, Dead Rising Road to Fortune. Frank West, haunted by memories of Willamette, wakes up in Hubbard Gulch, Nevada, 2 years after the Willamette incident. Disheveled and reliant on Zombrex, he hears a report from Rebecca Chang about a potential government-linked outbreak near Las Vegas. While Frank struggles with the cancellation of his show, Uncovered, his former agent, Clay Hurlton, pitches a new reality show, Terror is Reality, to Tyrone King. Meanwhile, Chuck Green drives to Las Vegas with his wife Pam and daughter Katie for a motocross competition. During the Las Vegas 250 race, Phenotrans agents led by Harjit Singh unleash Queens, triggering a zombie outbreak. Chuck's wife turns into a zombie, bites Katie, and is killed by Chuck, who escapes the chaos with his daughter in search of Zombrex. As special forces purge infected residents in Coyote Springs, Rebecca Chang investigates Phenotrans' role in the outbreaks. She meets Frank West, who suspects government involvement but dismisses Rebecca's theory about Phenotrans. Harjit, operating behind the scenes, silences a whistleblower and aids the spread of the outbreak. Chuck and Katie flee Las Vegas while Frank and Rebecca, blocked by Captain Kilduff, uncover hints of Phenotrans' sinister plans. As Phenotrans' leader Marion Mallon and Harjit Singh plot their next move, Chuck drives towards Still Creek, setting the stage for Case Zero. September 12th, 2008, Still Creek Outbreak, Dead Rising 2, Case Zero. Chuck Green and his young daughter Katie escape the chaos of Las Vegas as a sudden zombie outbreak tears the city apart. Chuck's wife doesn't make it out and is lost during the chaos, leaving him and his daughter to fend for themselves. In need of refueling, Chuck and Katie stop at a small gas station in the desert town of Still Creek, where they rest and where Chuck gives Katie a dose of Zombrex. As Chuck searches for any signs of life in the small town, he hears an explosion and sees smoke rising from a containment zone down the road. To make matters worse, someone steals his truck, his only mode of transportation, and their supply of Zombrex, leaving them stranded and without Zombrex. Zombies begin swarming Still Creek, forcing Chuck and Katie to barricade themselves inside the gas station. With Katie's next dose of Zombrex due soon, Chuck has no choice but to venture into the overrun town in search of more of the drug and a way out. Exploring Still Creek, Chuck finds Zombrex in an overturned ambulance and overhears a military broadcast warning of a cleanup operation scheduled for 9 p.m. Discovering a broken dirt bike, he decides to repair it, scavenging parts from around the town to ensure their escape. Along the way, he helps survivors, including a pawn shop owner who provides a wheel. After collecting all the parts, Chuck repairs the bike and administers Katie's Zombrex just in time. As they prepare to leave, Chuck faces a psychotic mechanic in a fight. After defeating him, he and Katie escape moments before the military arrives. Riding down the highway, Chuck spots their stolen truck abandoned, retrieves Katie's belongings, and dons his motocross jacket. With a promise to keep her safe, they ride off into the unknown. September 25th through September 29th, 2011. Fortune's End, Dead Rising 2. 3 years after the zombie outbreak in Las Vegas and Chuck and Katie's little run-in with zombies at Still Creek, the massive entertainment resort Fortune City becomes the epicenter of another zombie outbreak. The resort is chosen as the venue for Terror is Reality, a controversial game show where contestants kill zombies for fame and fortune. Among this episode's contestants is Chuck Green, who participates to win money to pay for Katie's Zombrex. Shortly after midnight, the zombies kept for the show are intentionally released into Fortune City. Chuck is knocked out briefly, and when he regains consciousness, he discovers that zombies have overrun the facility. Chuck rescues Katie and takes her to the Fortune City emergency shelter, which is sealed to protect survivors from the chaos. Raymond Sullivan, the shelter's head of security, hesitates to let Katie in due to an infection, but Chuck promises to keep her supplied with Zombrex until the military arrives in 3 days. Stacy Forsythe offers his support and watches over Katie. Stacy uses the shelter's camera and provides Chuck with a map and radio, guiding him to survivors and key locations. With Katie safe in the shelter, Chuck ventures into the city to find more Zombrex and uncover the truth behind the outbreak. After securing Katie's first dose of Zombrex, Chuck returns to the shelter and is shocked to see a news report falsely accusing him of causing the outbreak. Determined to clear his name, Chuck teams up with reporter Rebecca Chang, promising her a story if she helps him investigate. Meanwhile, Stacy warns Chuck that Sullivan is threatening to kick Katie out. When Chuck mentions Stacy to Rebecca, she reveals that Stacy is the leader of Cure, a zombie rights group protesting Terror is Reality's treatment of the undead, sparking Rebecca's curiosity. Rebecca agrees to meet them at the shelter. The next day, Chuck discovers that the TIR host Tyrone TK King released the zombies to stage a massive robbery of Fortune City's casinos during the chaos. Chuck foils TK's plans, prevents his escape by helicopter, and has him imprisoned in the shelter. However, TK reveals he's working for Phenotrans, the pharmaceutical company behind Zombrex, hinting at a larger conspiracy. When the military cleanup team arrives, a mysterious green gas begins to emanate from beneath the city, mutating the zombies into stronger and more aggressive forms. The military forces are quickly overwhelmed, and media reports falsely claim that the emergency shelter has no survivors. In response, the government announces plans to firebomb Fortune City to contain the infection. The shelter is sabotaged, forcing Chuck to repair the barricades. Despite his efforts, some zombies breach the defenses and TK is bitten. Now infected, TK begs for Zombrex to stay alive. Rebecca discovers the source of the gas in the underground tunnels, a secret Phenotrans facility. Chuck infiltrates the facility and learns that Phenotrans is harvesting zombies and producing Zombrex from the queens of genetically modified wasps that create zombies. The company intentionally triggered the outbreak to drive up demand for their drug. Chuck gathers evidence, including a satellite phone and laptop, and brings it to Rebecca. Before Rebecca can expose Phenotrans, Sullivan, revealed as a Phenotrans operative, murders her and steals the evidence. Chuck pursues Sullivan to a casino rooftop where Sullivan admits that Phenotrans was also responsible for the Las Vegas outbreak that killed Chuck's wife and infected Katie. In a climactic fight, Chuck handcuffs Sullivan to his skyhook harness, causing the recovery aircraft to bisect him as it takes off. Chuck contacts Rebecca's news station and offers proof of Phenotrans' involvement in exchange for a rescue. A helicopter arrives to evacuate the survivors, but the outcome depends on TK's fate. Now, if TK is given Zombrex, he kidnaps Katie and Stacy, suspending them over a zombie horde. Chuck confronts TK in a final battle, defeating him by throwing him off a platform to his death below. September 29th through 30th, 2011, Phenotrans Facility Outbreak, Dead Rising 2, Case West. After surviving the Fortune City outbreak, Chuck Green is attacked by a zombified TK in a bunker elevator. Overwhelmed and on the verge of defeat, Chuck is saved by the timely arrival of Frank West, who kills TK. Frank reveals that he came to Fortune City to meet Rebecca Chang, but Chuck informs him of her death and explains how Phenotrans orchestrated the outbreak and framed him. Skeptical, Frank reluctantly agrees to help investigate a nearby Phenotrans facility to uncover the truth, warning Chuck of serious consequences if he's lying. Before they leave, Frank takes a dose of Zombrex, revealing that he's infected from the Willamette incident 5 years earlier. The two break into the Phenotrans facility, determined to gather evidence of the corporation's involvement in the outbreaks. While investigating, they uncover Phenotrans' dark secrets. The development of Zombrex relies on forcibly harvesting queens from zombies, and the company has deliberately concealed the existence of a true cure. As they process this information, Frank angrily throws away his Zombrex, but Chuck quietly retrieves it. During their search, they free Frank's mysterious source, who's revealed to be Isabella Keyes. She explains that after the Willamette incident, Phenotrans captured her and stole her research on a cure for zombification. While she's explaining herself, Phenotrans's director, Dr. Marion Mallon, arrives and sends guards to capture them. Isabella escapes briefly, but returns to save Frank and Chuck, only to be knocked unconscious by Phenotrans security chief Harjit Singh. Before being captured, she throws a flash drive containing key evidence to Frank, but Harjit destroys it and attacks the pair. Frank and Chuck engage in a brutal fight with Harjit, who ultimately meets his end after falling into a glass tube filled with queens, where he's stung to death. Marion reveals that Phenotrans has perfected a cure for zombification, but refuses to release it, deeming humanity unworthy. She activates the facility's self-destruct mechanism and escapes with Isabella, leaving Chuck and Frank to flee as the facility is destroyed in a massive explosion. Back at a cliff overlooking the ruins, Chuck reflects on how much the cure could change the world, while Frank remains skeptical, suggesting Marion might have been lying. Though they've gathered enough evidence to clear Chuck's name, they lack the proof needed to fully expose Phenotrans. As Frank's watch beeps, reminding him of his next Zombrex dose, he realizes he discarded it during the mission. Accepting his fate, Frank prepares the worst until Chuck hands him the salvaged Zombrex, reasoning that the world still needs Frank West. Together, they leave the destroyed facility, resolved to continue their fight against Phenotrans. 2017, Zombrex chips are introduced. In 2017, the government introduces Zombrex chips to control the infected, administering daily doses of the drug while tracking individuals via GPS. However, mistrust grows as many infected refuse the chips, forming a group known as illegals. March 23rd through 31st, 2021, Los Perdidos Outbreak. Dead Rising 3. After years without a major zombie outbreak, disaster strikes once more, this time in Los Perdidos, California. The chaos begins when government-implanted Zombrex chips designed to suppress infection are mysteriously deactivated. Within hours, the infection spreads uncontrollably throughout the city. Now, before we begin proper, I wanted to give a special mention to the Dead Rising 3 DLC stories, Untold Stories of Los Perdidos. Each of these stories focuses in on a character that's featured in Dead Rising 3's story and provides extra details to the story of Dead Rising 3 to, fill in the blanks. However, we felt that this portion would get a little too convoluted if we wanted to, weave in everyone's story into deep detail. You see, the stories of these characters happen right before Nick Ramos' story starts, particularly the stories of Adam Kane, Angel Quijano, and Hunter Thibodeau, and end right as they interact with Nick in the main story. We will, however, talk about Brad Park's story later on. With that being said, let's get back to it. Nick Ramos, a mechanic, is caught in the middle of the chaos when an airplane crashes into the city. Nick is knocked unconscious but soon comes to and makes his way through the wreckage back to the Dilly Diner, where he and a small group, trucker Dick Baker, his boss Rhonda Kriske, and Annie, an illegal infected, take refuge. 3 days into the outbreak, the group learns of a government plan to firebomb the city in 6 days to contain the infection, because of course they're firebombing the city. Seeking a way out, they decide to head for the nearest quarantine station, where the government is supposedly evacuating survivors. Their efforts are in vain, as the station is abandoned and overrun by a biker gang. Nick is forced to kill the gang's leader, leaving him emotionally shaken. Rhonda reassures him, calling it self-defense. As they leave, the group is ambushed by Nick's best friend Diego, a soldier. Recognizing Nick, Diego halts the attack and reveals the existence of an old plane at a dockside warehouse that could help them escape. During their conversation, Nick is bitten by a zombie, and fearing infection, he heads to a crematorium in search of emergency Zombrex. At the crematorium, Nick encounters Gary Finkel, a mob enforcer searching for a body on behalf of his boss. They strike an uneasy deal. Gary agrees to help Nick search for Zombrex if Nick helps them find the body. When they locate the body, Nick fears it's Annie, but is relieved to discover it isn't. Gary informs Nick that the emergency Zombrex supply is depleted. Accepting his fate, Nick asks Gary to shoot him before he turns, but his bite heals on its own, revealing Nick's immunity. Relieved, Nick helps Gary deliver the body to his boss at the Diamond Panty. At the Diamond Panty, Gary's boss becomes enraged upon discovering the body isn't the girl he wanted. Gary offers Nick fuel for the plane in exchange for bringing Annie to the club. Nick returns to the warehouse and informs the group of the deal. Although he feels guilty, Nick tracks Annie to a watchtower marked with the symbol of the illegals. He admits his initial deception and offers to help, learning from Annie's leader, Red, that the government is executing survivors instead of evacuating them. Nick destroys military equipment as a show of trust and later retrieves a flash drive containing critical military footage from the police station, defeating Sergeant Hild in the process. process. Red promises to help secure the fuel, but later betrays Nick. Gary attempts to abduct Annie, but stops after Nick intervenes. The military then attacks, capturing Gary and the illegals while knocking Nick unconscious. Nick awakens and teams up with Red to infiltrate a military compound. There, he overhears General Hemlock and Marion Malin discussing their plans and learns the infected president is being held captive. Nick frees Annie and the captives with Red's help, though tensions remain high. Nick retrieves the plane's fuel and learns about a $5 million bounty on him and Diego. Rhonda suggests finding Diego at the museum. At the museum, Nick finds Diego, who has mentally snapped. After calming him, they discover exhibits linking the outbreak to Carlito and Isabella Keys. Diego points out their shared tattoo, tying them to the infected orphans from Carlito's experiments. The group returns to the warehouse where Rhonda repairs the plane, but decides not to join, opting to reconcile with her ex-husband instead. Nick, Dick, and Diego are ambushed by the military and taken to an underground lab. There, Marion tests them to determine who carries the cure. Diego dies during the experiment, releasing parasites all over the place. Nick discovers his immunity spares him and escapes with Isabella Keys, who reveals the outbreak was orchestrated to force Nick's immunity into the open. Marion attacks, but Nick defeats her and escapes. Nick finds Annie held hostage by Gary, who demands help in exchange for her release. After reuniting Gary with Rhonda, Nick frees Annie and returns to the warehouse. Isabella explains that Nick is the only orphan carrying the cure instead of the virus. Red betrays them, capturing Annie and Isabella for the bounty. Nick defeats Red and frees the captives. Intercepting a call from Hemlock, Nick delays the firebombing by 24 hours. He shares a kiss with Annie before Chuck Green, revealed as her father, arrives. Chuck and Annie reconcile after 2 years apart. The group prepares to escape on the plane. With limited space, Gary and Rhonda stay behind to help other survivors, while Nick, Chuck, Annie, Dick, and Isabella board the plane. Before takeoff, Nick overhears Hemlock's plan to weaponize zombies. Teaming up with Chuck, Nick destroys Hemlock's machines and kills him in a final confrontation. Before dying, Hemlock reveals Nick's blood holds the cure. The group escapes and later develops and distributes a cure for the infection. Sometime later, Isabella is revealed to have orchestrated the outbreak to showcase Nick's immunity, allowing her to take credit for the cure and restore her family's name. Destroying evidence of her involvement, she departs Los Perdidos with the survivors. Her plan, a success. 2021 Dead Rising 3 Untold Stories of Los Perdidos, The Last Agent. ZDC agent Brad Park, near death from a malfunctioning Zombrex chip, is saved when Nick Ramos gives him a life-saving dose of Zombrex, despite expressing disgust at the ZDC for its actions against people. Once Brad recovers, he resolves to investigate Nick's claim. He grabs a van and loads it with Zombrex and delivers it to Cora, a doctor at the Central City Hospital who contacts him over the radio. After delivering the medicine, Brad and Cora begin investigating why Zombrex chip implants are malfunctioning. Brad gathers chips from King Zombies using a device called the Pacifier and gives them to Cora, who discovers the chips have been deliberately deactivated. She advises Brad to enlist the help of a hacker. Brad tracks down Nelson, a computer expert who helps trace a jamming signal to the mayor's mansion in Sunset Hills. Upon arriving, Brad eliminates the soldiers guarding the server and uncovers information pointing to a secret military lab in the South Almuda train yard, with permission signed off by Dr. Marion Malin of Phenotrans. At the military lab, Brad uncovers a horrific scene: the mutilated corpse of Diego Martinez alongside dead scientists and soldiers, the result of a failed experiment orchestrated by Malin. He also finds evidence of atrocities linked to a military prison camp in the Ingleton Taxi Company. Feeling betrayed, Brad cuts out his Zombrex chip to avoid being tracked and sets out to find further proof of the conspiracy. At the taxi company, Brad encounters Adam Kane, who's gravely wounded and infected. Adam confesses that General Hemlock murdered President Paddock and reveals that the black box in his possession contains evidence exposing the government's actions in Los Perdidos. Adam entrusts the box to Brad, urging him to do the right thing before taking his own life to avoid turning. With the critical evidence in hand, Brad contacts Cora and organizes an escape. After picking up Cora and the remaining survivors in a heavily armored ZDC truck, Brad radios for a helicopter extraction. The group arrives at the Dilly Diner, where they're airlifted out of the city just before a potential firebombing. Reflecting on the government's betrayal and the ZDC's role on the atrocities, Brad throws away his badge, expressing his disgust. Fast forward to September 2021, the second Willamette outbreak, Dead Rising 4. In September 2021, Frank West, a former photojournalist now teaching at a college, is approached by his student Vicky Vic Chu to investigate a military compound near Willamette, Colorado, the site of the first zombie outbreak. Inside, they uncover research being conducted on zombies but are discovered and forced to flee. Frank is falsely accused of terrorism and becomes a fugitive. Assuming the new identity of Hank East, clever, he returns to teaching photography. Smart move! Surely they'll never find you, Frank. 2022, back to Willamette. 4 months later, by January 2022, Frank West is found by Brad Park, a ZDC agent who offers to help clear his name if Frank investigates a new zombie outbreak in Willamette during Black Friday sales. Vic, Frank's student, has already gone ahead to investigate. Upon arriving, their helicopter is shot down, crash landing in the mall. This time, the zombies inside the mall appear to be infected with a more aggressive strain resistant to Zombrex. Shortly after, Frank uncovers Obscurus, a secretive organization hunting a mutant called Calder. Calder, an Obscurus soldier enhanced with a military exoskeleton, has been accidentally transformed into a violent but intelligent zombie-like mutant. He possesses a hard disk containing data from Dr. Russell Barnaby. Remember him? The scientist behind the original outbreak, who had been researching intelligent zombies. Frank realizes he has to confront Calder to retrieve the data. Frank clashes with Obscurus and its leader Fontana, who admits that the group isn't responsible for the outbreak but was hired to retrieve Calder's data to create intelligent zombie labor. Their confrontation is cut short when Calder kills Fontana. After rescuing survivors from survivalists, Frank tracks Calder into the sewers, transferring the disk's data to his camera. However, Vic intercepts him, forcing him to hand over the camera and destroys the disk. In the final confrontation, Calder destroys the camera, but Frank and Vic work together to kill him. After the battle, Vic reveals that she saved the camera's SD card containing the data. They reconcile and agree to share credit for the story. As they head to the helicopter extraction, a massive zombie horde attacks. Frank sacrifices himself to ensure Vic and Brad escape, cementing his legacy as a hero. 2022, Frank Rising. Frank, after falling from the helicopter, is half eaten by zombies. However, after the zombies disperse, experimental wasps infect him, transforming him into one of the Evo zombies. This mutation grants him abilities like acid spit and pouncing. Consumed by his new nature, he begins feeding on humans and zombies alike until he's shot at Willamette Mall and captured. He's taken to Barnaby's lab where Dr. Blackburn, an obscure scientist, restores his humanity but removes his powers. Blackburn warns Frank that the military plans to firebomb Willamette because, of course they do, and that his only chance of survival is to evacuate via helicopter, because of course it is. While Frank's abilities are suppressed, Blackburn reveals that he could regain them by absorbing wasps from Evo zombies. Frank asks about a cure, and Blackburn agrees to help if he gathers supplies for her research. As Frank collects the needed materials, Blackburn eventually double-crosses him, but he threatens her into continuing their deal. Blackburn explains that she needs access to Barnaby's lab, which is currently inaccessible due to high radiation levels. Eventually, Frank is successfully cured back to his human self and manages to escape Willamette with Blackburn in an evacuation helicopter. Now, the ending depends on the player's actions, leaving multiple possibilities for Frank's fate since there isn't a Dead Rising 5 to confirm the canon outcome. So, if Frank does collect all the special wasps during the game, he escapes alone with Blackburn and retires from journalism, living the rest of his life in fear of turning back into a zombie. If Frank does collect all the special wasps, Hammond and her team escape with him, and Frank regains his fame, writing a best-selling book about his experience as a zombie. With Vic's help, he exposes the government's involvement with Obscurus. And if the player runs out of time during the cases, the story ends in failure as the United States government orders the bombardment of Willamette to prevent the outbreak from spreading. And that is the simplified but complete Dead Rising timeline. What do y'all think? Are you fans of Dead Rising? Which one is your favorite? Comment down below and let us know. If you want other timelines, let us know in the comments as well. And don't forget to subscribe to the Leaderboard, your home for video game facts.